Chapter 23, and let's see if we can do 2 chapters today. We set a record last week.
Are we ready?
We are ready.
Okay. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead." As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes and the Pharisaic party stood up and began to agree heartily, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also."
Okay, let's pause there for a minute. I like the message, the way that issue where they were going to slap Paul.
Tear him apart.
God will slap you down. What a fake you are. You sit there and judge me by the law and then break the law by ordering me slapped around. But we have now in the book of Acts a very interesting change of scene and style. Starting about chapter 20, but it's really building now as we get to 23 and to the end of the book. Earlier in Acts, it was a story of Paul's ministry and conversion of people. But starting with chapter 20, we see mostly it's a trial. Paul was arrested. In 21, he was, they had arrested him. 22, he was, trying to fight. And, his claim always was, I'm a Roman citizen. Now, some commentators say, well, we're really not sure he was a Roman citizen. I mean, how do you prove you're a Roman citizen? Well, he may have carried a little passport, some kind of document that shows that he's a Roman citizen, but those can be forged. And when he said, "I'm a Roman citizen," Romans don't want to challenge that and find out they were wrong. So,
but Paul wouldn't lie.
Well,
They don't know that.
yeah, they don't know that. And
But I do.
but I think the case can be made that Paul was a Roman citizen. I mean, he was born in Tarsus, which was a Roman center. He was born to wealthy people. I mean, his family had money, and he was sent off to study at the big university for Pharisees. And the name Paul is not a name. It's not an everyday name. So if his name was Paul, and the chances were, he used Saul when he was in Hebrew land, but he switched to Paul as soon as he crossed into Greek. Remember when he left Cyprus and went into Greece? All of a sudden, he was now Paul. So, he was. But I will say one thing. This points out that Paul was not a dumb guy. I mean, he was very shrewd, because he gets there knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees. So he called out in the Sanhedrin, "I'm a Pharisee, descendant of Pharisees, and I stand on trial for the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And when he said this, a dispute broke out. Now, I've never gone for a doctorate, but I know you have to defend a thesis, your doctorate. When I was an undergrad, I had to defend my undergraduate paper. Bless you. My undergraduate paper, the philosophy department where I went to school required you to write a paper and then defend it. Well, somebody gave me advice before I got into the room, because I had written my paper on an area that most of the instructors didn't think much of. They were what we call logical positivists. They were looking at mathematical type proofs. Mine was more intuitive. And somebody said, "Get them arguing amongst themselves." I had one question I fielded, and the second question I made a comment, and somebody said, "Oh, how can you agree with that?" And the other guy says, "Well, how can you not agree with it?" I sat there for half an hour and listened to these guys argue. And when they were finished, they said, "Well, you pass. Congratulations." Now, my advisor said in my last paper, "You're not a philosopher, but you've become a writer." So I was happy with that, because there were more writing jobs available than there were philosophy jobs.
Well, the big thing is your friend helped you realize that you had to know your audience. And
Yes, yes. And that's exactly what Paul did. He's got the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So what's he do? He sets them up to let them argue it out. He just steps back. And this does point out here the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Yeah, really.
The Pharisees believed in a resurrection. The Sadducees said that there was no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believed in all those things. Well, here we are, he's at the Sanhedrin. What's he do? He gets the boys arguing with each other. And he just sits down, and finally, when the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn into pieces by them, he takes him out. Paul is one shrewd dude.
Is this high priest the same one who also looked over the trial of Jesus? Nice.
I think it was a son.
Oh,
I think it was passed on, because this is happening in 55 to 60. That guy would have been dead. This is 50 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. So those guys would have really been pretty old at that time. So most of them would be dead. So anyway, one of the arguments that they make against Paul is he's anti-Jewish. So here's a guy who says, I'm a Roman citizen, but I'm a Jew. So some people are saying, hold on, what are you going to be? Good Jew, good Roman. And remember, the early church, Paul always went to the synagogues, but the synagogues were filled with people who were disagreeing. Some of them were people who believed Jesus was the Messiah. They were Jews, but you might say they were Jewish Christians. And then you had dyed-in-the-wool Hebrew Jews. They didn't believe any of that. So you can imagine some of those temples were filled with people who were disagreeing, arguing with one another. Thank God that never happens in churches today. But you know, when you look at, when churches have disagreements and we think, oh, I wish we could live in the time of Jesus and Paul. Well, hell, they had the same problem. They had people who disagreed. And the unfortunate thing is both sides thought they were right.
Oh.
I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought they were right. Now, the Sadducees were more of a ordained kind of group. The Pharisees were lay lawyers.
Oh, lay Lord.
Lay lawyers. They were the ones who knew the law. And if you needed to find a route around the law for something you wanted to do, you'd go to a Pharisee because he could figure out how to do it. And so, they were well steeped in the law. The Sadducees, which is interesting because they believed in spirits. The Sadducees, who were more closer to the priestly class, they didn't. It was sort of, flip-flop from what I remember from Sunday school. So, but I know that question comes up occasionally. Do any Jews believe in resurrection and angels and spirits? The Pharisees did. The Sadducees did. So certainly there was an argument between Pharisees and Sadducees. You get the Sadducees on the left side of the church and the Pharisees on the right side of the church, and try to call a new minister. I mean, it becomes very hard. So now we've come up to where they're going to get a plot to kill Paul. And we know that's not going to happen because there are 28 chapters. Unless it was
It does seem like, though, as we talk about the various places he visits and all that, I get what he's trying to do, but it just seems like he's looking for trouble.
Well, it followed him everywhere he went, didn't it? And
I
guess that's the only way you can spread the word and convert somebody.
Sometimes you gotta stir the pot.
Yeah.
Now the commentary says that the main point of Paul's speech in Acts 22 seeks to prove that Paul is a loyal Jew, thus rebutting the charges against his teaching. So, even though he was espousing Jesus as the Messiah, there were people who were saying, this guy's not a Jew. Why are we even letting him into the synagogue? Well, he was a loyal Jew. And remember, why was he rushing in 21 and 22? Why was he rushing to get back to Jerusalem? The Passover. He wanted to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. Now, if he was a loyal Jew, would he really care about the Passover? Yeah, I think he did. I mean, it's ingrained in him. For a Jew, that's ingrained. And my friends who are Jewish, a lot of, many of them never darkened the doorstep of the synagogue. But boy, let Passover hit. And all of a sudden they become very Jewish.
Do they follow the dietary laws?
During Passover, a lot of them would. But, and at Hanukkah, they got the candelabra, they light the candle. I mean, but the rest of the...
like Christmas and Easter Christians.
Yeah. Well, it's just, I was gonna say, it's like a lot of Christians, they go to church on Easter, they go to church on Christmas. In fact, I don't know if I told you this before or not, but one year on Easter, one of the churches I was at, which explains why I probably aren't at that anymore, is I said to the congregation, I'd like to wish all of you who won't be here till Christmas a happy Thanksgiving.
Oh,
And
There's a sign, I don't know if it's on Facebook or out on Main Street somewhere at a church, but it says, we're open next Sunday too.
and you know what every minister calls the Sunday after Easter? Low Sunday.
Yeah.
And that's, in theory, it's because, Easter's a high church celebration, whistles, bells, and all the smoke and all that. But the next Sunday, it's low church, but it really means it's low attendance.
Low attendance.
If you had a chance to talk to, you said you have a lot of friends that are Jews. If you had a chance to, I would imagine, and staring them right in the face, Isaiah 53, how do they choke themselves around that one? Because they embrace the Old Testament so much, and that's totally messianic. Is it they embrace that, but they don't embrace Jesus? So they really have a disconnect there. Have you heard talk about it?
We usually don't talk religion.
Okay.
That's why you're still friends.
Yeah, that's why we're still friends. But I'm sure they would say, well, we believe in a Messiah. He just isn't here yet.
Yeah.
And, we believe Jesus was a nice guy and did a lot of good, but we don't believe he is the Messiah who's to come.
And that was all Paul and the disciples, that's all they wanted to talk. And Philip talk about, or Stephen, talk about how he fulfilled it, step by step by step by step, all the way through the Bible. They were validating the Old Testament.
But remember, all of those guys who were Jewish believed Jesus was the Messiah, but they believed everything else about Jewish history. They just believed that Jesus was the Savior. But they still bought all the rest. Remember, in the other speeches that we've read earlier in Acts and in some of the other scriptures, it talks about it always starts off with the Jewish history. Paul in many of his speeches said, remember we were called out of Egypt, and he goes through this whole thing. And this is when, a lot of times when he's talking to people in the temple, he's not saying you guys are wrong. He's saying you guys haven't reached far enough.
These guys would meet with the, pardon me.
He said, they said the Messiah was coming, and Paul's trying to tell him he did come.
Yes.
You don't have to wait anymore.
Yes.
But they couldn't buy into that. I don't know what they're expecting.
Well, I don't know. They didn't buy that Jesus was the Messiah to come. Part of the reason, I think, was he didn't lead them into war. They were looking for a Messiah who was going to gird up his loins and take on the Romans.
And you have the king.
And the king, yeah. So Jesus didn't fit the description of what they thought it should be. And I know, I've seen pictures, in synagogues, a lot of times around the wall, they inscribe names of heroes, Moses, Abraham, Isaiah, all the prophets. One synagogue has Jesus' name up there. Because he was, we forget, Jesus was a Jew. A lot of us like to think he was an Episcopalian or a Lutheran. He didn't make enough money to be an Episcopalian.
Couldn't afford all the robes.
Yes.
I would have thought that the new converts that were Jews and they converted, there must have been a period of years when they would have friends that were Jews, and I suppose some of them went back just to keep the peace and did a little sacrificing here and there, and there was this blurring line. That's what I think happened to the Galatians.
Mhm.
He finally said, "You foolish Galatians, you don't do that anymore."
It's hard to imagine what's happening at this time of Paul and that gap between Paul and the resurrection. Because all of those people who ran to that empty tomb and gathered in that upper room were Jews. I mean, they were, and remember, the road to Emmaus, which I think is probably read this week, because last Sunday, the first Sunday after Easter, is always the Doubting Thomas Sunday. I think this Sunday may be the road to Emmaus. Those guys on the road to Emmaus are walking with Jesus. They don't recognize him. And he tells them the history of the Jews and how he fits into it. They still didn't know who he was until the breaking of bread.
Well, we just heard from Father Ted, the gospel lesson, that it was about them he has to show them the nail in his hands.
Yeah. And Thomas, Thomas wanted to see the
Well, I
nail.
think he was showing them to more than just Thomas.
There were people gathered in verse 15.
But I,
Sacrifice,
no, that's fine.
sacrifice for the Jews became repentance for the Christians. When Levi did something wrong, he'd grab a goat. Okay, you gotta get this taken care of right now, but we're asked to repent without the blood sacrifice.
Yeah. Well, see, that's what was very appealing to the non-Jewish
A lot cleaner.
Greeks.
Right.
And, they, unlike the Jews, they didn't have to sacrifice an animal. So they didn't have to get their hands dirty. And unlike the Roman tradition, they didn't have to worship some kind of idol or god. So all of a sudden, you might say for Gentiles, it became very Protestant. We don't have to do all these rituals that the Jews want and the people who are worshiping idols. What they do, we just have to love one another, be kind, help one another.
Easier sell.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't have all that ritual. You didn't have to put a temple in your house and pray to. You just became a nicer person.
So did they have barbecue ribs on the Gentile side?
Well, they may have. I mean, because Gentiles were eating pork. I mean, they never had a problem with pork. I found another note here I wanted to share with you. Paul's Roman citizenship really became an issue in Acts 16 and 22. In both cases, Paul only draws his citizenship to the attention of Roman officials and those working under them, and in both cases, Paul's announcement of his citizenship is made for the purpose of influencing the conduct of his fellow Roman citizens. So, and Paul I don't think Paul ever, in any of the epistles, any of his letters, I don't think Paul ever said, I'm a Roman citizen. And really, the only two times he pulled that out of his hat was
Paul and Silas.
When he was in trouble.
when he was in trouble. I mean, it kind of like, hey, don't do that. I'm an Episcopalian. Oops. So,
I have just a curiosity, it probably means nothing in what you're talking about, but why wouldn't Paul think he could have observed Passover in one of those other villages and towns or whatever? Why did he think he had to be in Jerusalem? I know the storyline wouldn't have worked,
yeah.
but why did he feel like he had to be there for the Passover? I mean, why not somewhere else?
Well, remember, the temple in Jerusalem,
That was the
that
holy.
was a holy place.
Mhm.
I mean, Jews, it's like the Muslims, Mecca. You know, that one of the 5 rules is you got to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life.
So it was just a matter of his demonstration of his dedication
Yes.
to his faith.
Yeah, he wanted to go to the high church.
Yeah.
And so, but you're right. I mean, he could have gone to any of those other churches, and they would have been happy to have him. You know, they would have been very pleased if this Paul, who was such a special man, he said, "Hey, I'll do it with you."
What country is Mecca in?
Saudi Arabia, I believe. I remember Bishop Strickland was bishop 3 bishops back.
Yeah, or so.
He's 4 bishops back. He came, this is before I arrived out here, but on Palm Sunday, he was scheduled to be at Christ Church. And they called and they said, "Bishop, wouldn't you rather be at the cathedral?" And he said, "No, God's at all of them. I'll be there with you." And they were so impressed that the bishop would humble himself to come to Christ Church Kingman for Palm Sunday, that he could have done no wrong.
Well, that was kind of the tradition. I grew up in the cathedral. We thought we were pretty special.
Mm-hmm.
And the bishop needed to go to the people who thought they were pretty special or hear about it.
Yep.
So if they were going to do something like confirmation,
Speak
dedicate
up, I can
something.
barely hear you.
Well, Palm Sunday, Easter, Christmas, it's always assumed that, and Pentecost, the bishop would be at the cathedral. Because that's where his seat was.
Right,
And
that's where he lived.
it was always interesting because the dean of the cathedral would always, you know, they always wanted to preach and celebrate on those big days. And the bishop would show up, and the bishop always got to decide who was going to do what. And I remember back in Michigan, the bishop, I was on the cathedral chapter, and the bishop was telling me after one of the meetings that he showed up at the cathedral, and the dean was expecting the bishop to do everything. And the
Just sat
bishop
in his special
and the
seat.
bishop said, "Oh, why don't you preach and let one of the canons celebrate?" He said, "You know, I kind of like to have a day off."
Just
and they
sit
were
up there in his
stunned.
special seat.
Yeah, they were stunned. He just sat in his seat.
When we were being nasty little kids, we loved to troop around up there toward the front of the church by the altar and sit in the bishop's seat.
And you know what that seat is called?
That was a sin.
There's a name for the bishop's seat, the cathedra.
Oh, I didn't know
I'm
that.
so happy.
You taught me that.
So
That's why you're so special. You sat in his
Are
seat.
we going to read about Paul?
Just so
Yes, yeah.
soaks in.
let's get back on Paul. Since
We ourselves are
Are we on
called kings
chapter
and
22?
priests and ambassadors to the Most High
I think I
God.
was doing
right,
23.
okay.
Well, that was
Yeah.
interesting.
Since Bob's not here to
We
move
got
us
off
on,
Yeah.
Kathy has assumed that responsibility. So read on.
A conspiracy to kill Paul. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the palace." But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you. The commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, What is it that you have to report to me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander led the young man, go instructing him, Tell no one that you have notified me of these things.
Okay, let's pause there for a minute. Now, another reason why Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem is the way Luke is telling the story. Paul, where was Jesus crucified?
Oh.
Jerusalem.
Mm.
So they're trying to draw a parallel.
Okay.
Paul goes before the Sanhedrin. They accuse him. He gets out. They get him in prison, and now these guys are gone on a hunger strike. They're not going to eat until they kill him. So I think we're trying to draw a parallel, and they do that a lot. It wasn't with Stephen. I think there was supposed to be a parallel story. Other thing has anyone ever heard of Paul's sister before?
No,
No.
it's the only place.
And what's her name? We have no idea.
Pauline.
Pauline. Or maybe Jolene. And Dolly Parton wrote a song about her.
That's it.
I think so.
Jolene.
And her son, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here
His
Paul's
name.
got a nephew.
Who knew?
Now we do.
Yeah. It's interesting. Sometimes we get names, sometimes we don't. And maybe her name was just too easy to pronounce, so they didn't want to put it in. It was really a hard name. But, that is really, I think, the only mention of Paul's family, at least in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
Do you know any other mention of Paul's family?
I think her name was Salome.
Salome.
You can make a jingle out of that.
I wonder why he was there. Was some of Paul's family traveling with him? Or?
Well, we don't know. I mean, they're from Tarsus. This is all happening in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So unless they were down there for the Passover, but it's very interesting that, here, how is Paul going to kind of avoid this whole evil thing that is going to happen? Well, his sister arises and sends her son, and they warned Paul. And he said, some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. I mean, what more information could they want?
I kind of wanted to laugh when it says they went to the chief priests and said, we have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything. It just struck me kind of funny, like, okay, go ahead, don't
Yeah.
eat, I don't care.
Yeah, it's a hunger strike.
Yeah, just have your
I
fun.
bet they started eating crow.
Yeah.
In a footnote in our, I don't know, New International Version, it says this is the only biblical reference to Paul's family. Some scholars believe that Paul's family had disowned him when he became a Christian.
Oh.
When he became a Christian.
But I would beg to differ on that, because even though Paul was a Christian, he still was a Jew.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Well,
would,
in his mind.
in his mind, I mean, he's not saying, let's dump the whole Jewish stuff.
Right.
He's just saying, hey, we keep this Jewish stuff, but here's something we're gonna add to it. I mean, it's,
Fulfillment.
yeah, I mean, it's not like the Amish when one of their members say, well, I'm gonna become a whatever, and they shun them. I mean, again, I think we project contemporary times onto biblical figures.
Oh,
We're saying Paul was a Christian, and we're imagining him going around, wearing a cross and saying, I'm just going to eat barbecue. I like ribs, and I'm not following any of that Jewish stuff.
right.
He never really. I don't think Paul ever said a bad thing about Jews. When even in his letters. So, I question:
Uh-huh.
are we imposing,
That
Christianity on Paul? Well, he obviously went to church on all the holy days, and he was planning to pledge 10%, never got around to it. So, okay, Kathy, let's go on.
Kathy, Marty.
Never mind.
Marty.
And Paul moved to Caesarea, and he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea, with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter having this form: Claudius Lycurgus, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that they would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Anapartus. Did I pronounce that right?
Close enough.
That's enough.
Okay. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive, also giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium.
Okay.
We got to 24. We got to chapter
Yep.
24.
The message, I like the way that letter that's sent to Felix. I rescued this man from a Jewish mob. They had seized him and were about to kill him when I learned that he was a Roman citizen. So I sent my soldiers wanting to know what he had done wrong. I had him brought before their council. It turned out to be a squabble turned vicious over some of their religious differences, but nothing remotely criminal. Does that remind you of another time where they said, I find nothing wrong with this man?
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous parallel here. The next thing I knew, they had cooked up a plot to murder him. Again, I decided that for his own safety, I better get him out of here and in a hurry. So I'm sending him to you. I'm informing his accusers that he's now under your jurisdiction.
Yeah.
You know, we sent him to the Roman official who said, I find nothing wrong with this guy. You go back. So, you know, it really, and we're going to find, you know, it just seems like Paul is before the judge for the rest of the book of Acts.
Yeah.
So, anyone have any questions or comments about that?
Do you think that Paul wrote letters and then read letters?
Thank
Because he was responsible for his own writing, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, although there's some who believe that Timothy wrote some of the letters. And biblical scholars believe that all those letters that are attributed to Paul, only about half of them were actually Pauline letters.
But they were from Paul to a church, right?
Except for a couple of them, they were addressed. One of them was written to an individual, but you're right. You know, he wrote to Galatia, he wrote to Rome, he wrote to Corinth.
Well, could he have dictated the letters to Timothy?
Well, yeah, he could have.
It's interesting how so many paragraphs are where sentences are today,
Yes.
but paragraphs, but comma, 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 comma.
Well, it's like his introduction in his letters.
Yeah.
I mean, he wouldn't pass an English comp class today. I mean, it's just unbelievable. In fact, I don't know, we read the book of Acts during the season of Easter, and occasionally we'll just read chapter, like the first chapter, and, you know, it's that long. I mean, it's, you think, my God, Paul, take a breath.
In business school, they teach you brevity and
Yes.
concise wording. He wouldn't pass.
No, he wouldn't.
Now we
So,
live in an age of sound bites.
yes, that's right. Well, let's pick up, we'll do chapter 24. Boy, we're just cooking.
We're zooming along.
I like the part where they told how many people accompanied him.
Yes,
Yeah. That was so, like, they're gonna be sure he gets there alive. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen.
yeah.
That's
Just to
a,
get Paul to where
yeah,
he said.
that was gonna be a sure thing.
You wouldn't need that many because the Jews are on a hunger strike.
That's true.
I mean, you
Yeah,
know, if
that's
they had
what
to,
it said.
if they had to march, they wouldn't march far.
Like overkill.
That's true.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
How
All right, chapter
No,
24
no,
next
only-
week.
only